All right. Well, this is the SIG Auth meeting for March 8th, 2017. Have a fair amount on the agenda, so we'll go ahead and jump in. Just to summarize where we are with 1.6. 1.6 code freeze happened last Monday, I think. We had a few bug fixes go in. We don't actually have any flake issues attributed to our SIG at the moment, so that's great. If you become aware of one, be sure you tag the SIG in it or mention the SIG, and we'll get that looked at right away. Bugs, there is only one that is potentially in the milestone right now. That's the OpenID Connect bug. Eric, you want to talk through that real quick?
Yeah, it's just a bug on our side with verifying the OpenID Connect metadata that gets returned. That's part of discovery. It's we only hit it. Somebody reported hitting that corner case with Okta, and it doesn't have any functional changes because we don't actually use the field that we're verifying. But the guy is just getting having a little trouble with GoDep. So we'll see how that goes.
All right. This isn't a regression, so if we can get the GoDep thing, get the PR happy soon, we can probably tag it in. Otherwise, we'll probably wait for a point release.
Yeah, sounds good.
Just a summary on RBAC. I posted in the Slack channel link to the 1.6 documentation, so that's also linked from the agenda. Feedback on this, like I said, is welcome. So you can either give feedback in the Slack channel or open issues in the doc repo, or if you want to open a PR yourself, that's fine. Be aware that the doc repo targets pulls to the release 1.6 branch. So they actually do development sort of backwards from how the main repo does it. So they develop in the release branch, and then when 1.6 is released, they will merge that to master. So that's, just be aware of that if you want to open a PR. The different deployment methods, kubeadm and kubeup, are enabling RBAC by default. COPS is proposing to enable by default. They do their 1.6 development work after Kube actually cuts the 1.6 release. So that's a link to their roadmap, and it looks like they're interested in enabling it by default, which is great. The secured kubelet API, which was available in 1.5, is now enabled by default in kubeadm and kubeup. That's great to see. Other than that, I didn't have a lot else to talk about for 1.6. I know we'll have some work to do for the release notes to get people pointed to the documentation for using RBAC. One of the things that's in the link to documentation is a migration strategy. So if you're upgrading from a previous release, how you get from sort of an insecure or a really permissive ABAC policy to a more controlled RBAC policy. So there are a couple strategies discussed there. We just want to, anytime you tighten permissions, it can be disruptive. So we want to give people pointers to the steps they need to take that'll work best for them. If they don't care about scoping permissions, then there's one step they can run to get back the permissive permissions. If they do care about scoping, we want to walk them through that. Anyone else have anything for 1.6 that we need to be aware of?
The docs look great, by the way. The RBAC stuff.
Ah, thanks. Okay. Well, I thought we would sort of spend the rest of the time talking about whatever people want to talk about. That seems to be sort of 1.7-ish stuff. If people have longer term stuff they want to talk about, we can certainly add that to the end of the list. But there's a lot of things we can go do, and so knowing what people are planning to go do is helpful, so we don't duplicate effort, and then knowing areas where we might need some help if you're looking for something to work on and aren't sure what to work on. So The first three things I threw in the list, these are sort of taking the work that we're doing and helping other parts of the project or people using Kubernetes to actually understand it and make use of it. So before we get to the next set of features or improvements we want to do down at the bottom, I really do think we need to pay attention to how we document stuff, making sure people are aware of what needs to be done to harden a Kubernetes install, what the different threat models are. And then we have pretty good admin-focused documentation, but essentially no user-focused documentation. So this release is kind of the first release where it's been reasonable for an admin to set up a cluster and give users permissions in individual namespaces. And so we need documentation for those users that don't have the ability to go do cluster level stuff, but do need to be able to manage a particular namespace. So were there other sort of big categories of documentation that people have in mind that we need to go work on? Okay. And as we go through these, if you are interested in helping or participating, speak up or add your name beside this. And I think ideally we would get polls open for some of these areas and then let groups of 2, 3, 4, 5, whoever wants to, obviously, but just get a few people working on each of these areas, kind of split up, divide and conquer.
Yeah, we have a new CoreOS developer here who's new to the upstream stuff, so we'll probably have...
I'll be more than happy to take some of them on.
Yep.
All right, so you want to throw GitHub handles or something after those, and we'll accumulate a few names and then tag people into PRs?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Deployments, something similar there. So I spent a fair amount of time this release working with KubeUp and KubeAtom. If we have people who ideally are users of various deployment methods that want to sort of help contribute from an auth perspective to those. So I don't know if we have COPS users in the SIG, but if you are, then your familiarity with COPS and with the auth stuff would be great if you could kind of take some of the best practices, the hardening steps, and at least inform and ideally contribute some of those to the different deployers. So again, if you're a user or are interested in working with a particular deployment, throw your name in there, and we'll just try to organize that, make sure we're not duplicating effort. And then the last category I had was the add-on stuff. So in 1.6, we've defined RBAC roles for all of the core controllers and all of the control plane components. So the API server and the nodes and controller manager and scheduler and proxy. And then a couple of the sort of fundamental add-ons like Heapster and DNS. But there are lots of other add-ons that are not, that don't have roles defined and are still running essentially as cluster admin. And so this is where we need to take the knowledge we have and the experience we have and spread that out because there's no way 3 or 4 people are going to be able to write roles for everything that wants to run on every Kubernetes cluster in the world. And so I think the first step is to figure out what we would like add-ons to look like from an authentication authorization perspective. And that'll involve working with the add-on, the developers, the add-on manager, and kind of working together to figure out how to accomplish that. And then putting together documentation, sort of so you want to write an add-on document that says one of the things you need to think about is what permissions does your add-on need and how do you get those permissions. So I would like to see us focus on these three areas. There are a few things that I think are must-haves for 1.7 feature-wise, and everyone probably has their own idea of what is a must-have. But we have to remember, if we go add new features and we don't document them and help people use them, then it doesn't matter that they exist if they're not being used. So. Again, before we move on to specific auth features, are there any other sort of outward-facing engagement, I guess, aspects that you think we're overlooking as far as getting the right information to the right people so that they can make use of what we're building or have already built? All right. Well, if you think of any, throw it in the list or email the group. Okay, well, let's move on to kind of specific plans. And really, this was just trying to capture work that is already in progress or that people are already planning to do. I know we all have a long list of things we wish existed, but I think first I want to find out, like, what are people already working on or planning to work on, and then what bandwidth do people have to kind of take on additional feature requests and then prioritize among those. So I'll just go really quickly through the first two. Those are the ones I have at the top of my list. So node authorizer, for a long time, we have wanted to partition node permissions. So right now, if you compromise a node, any node has permission to request any secret and to write any pod. They request any secret because they need to be able to mount secrets into secret volumes for pods, and they need to write any pod because nodes can create mirror pods that reflect static pods on disk. And so we have long wanted to partition that so that a node is only allowed to get secrets that have been declared to be mounted to pods running on that node. And a pod or a node should only be able to write pods that are mirror pods that don't mount any secrets. And so I'm working on setting up an authorizer specifically for the node so that we can subdivide that permission. That'll reduce the impact of compromising a single node. And then the second one is related to pod security policy. There are a couple of improvements that have been requested. So the ability to use a particular pod security policy within a particular namespace so that you could let someone run privileged pods, but only in one namespace. And then some similar work to what we did with RBAC, where we define a few sort of sane policies, one that allows privileged stuff, one that allows restricted stuff, and just restricted volumes in a pod. Just a part of making it more usable so that users don't have to start from scratch.
And another question would be whether we even want to consider enabling that by default, right? Like the node authorizer is mostly a problem today because you can take over any node trivially if you're a pod. Mm-hmm. And so like what are the overlapping, like how does the security model of pod security policy need to be strengthened, defaulted, et cetera? Whether we would consider doing an out-of-the-box secure policy, or whether everybody would complain that would break them, which it would.
It would. Yeah. It's a lot less clear to me. Well, I guess we could make similar statements to what we do with RBAC, which is restricted by default, and if you don't care, then you're one command away from opening it back up to the whole cluster. I don't know. I can see both ways.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this comes back to working with the deployments, right? So if you just start up, run Kubernetes raw, I'm not sure which mode I would expect it to start in. But if you run a kubeadm deployment or a kube deployment or a kops deployment, I'd probably expect it to start locked down. I think Yeah. So working with the deployments to figure out what is their, how are they positioning their deployment? Are they positioning it as a hardened deployment to their users and configuring it appropriately? All right. I think the next few were Clayton's. You want to talk to those?
Yeah. So there's been a long-running discussion about encrypting secrets at rest, and is it, a few people in the community have been working on a design, and there's some general recommendations that we can make as to the deployers, to the deployments, like recommending encryption at rest, or recommending encryption of disks, which on GCE you get by default, and there's various settings for that. This kind of started getting into that next level, which is, just for various reasons, there are ticky mark sorts of security checkboxes around if the backup for the etcd database went missing or got copied accidentally, if someone were able to get read access to etcd but not write access. The secrets and the secret contents provide a fairly easy way to escalate very quickly. And so it's kind of a general hygiene defense in depth we'd at least discussed, putting in a not overly complicated but reasonably secure option that someone might turn on to encrypt the secrets themselves in etcd. The proposal is fairly far along on the mechanics and some of like how we might do this in storage. An implementation of the storage layer is actually mostly done. It's not a very complex setup. The harder things are around things like key rotation and how do you actually then expand that security model. So one of at least the proposals was to take this in baby steps, to have the capability to do simple encryption, to manage the keys yourself, and then over time let people provide feedback around additional key rotation strategies. So I encourage people to take a look at the proposal, even if we might not necessarily, it's kind of intended to be kind of a walking path that provides a little bit extra security for people who want to ensure that at rest they're doing a little bit of extra due diligence to keep that data safe.
Clayton, can I add something?
Sure.
We chatted about this a little bit. I think we said we both kind of thought that the evolution is not to continuously add more better encryption and features to Kubernetes core secrets, but after this initial round of improvements in terms of the encryption at rest, to begin relying more on external secret stores to provide more features.
Yep.
And I have got a roadmap plan for how we can do that, which I can share.
Yep. And I think that's a really good point. Like the breaking out the pieces so that they're not a big ball of mud from a security perspective is the thing that makes us more secure. And that fits with the other things, like teasing apart the concerns kind of fits into like a long-term, how can we do this better and how can we be more flexible?
I'm trying to sort of divide this up as far as what we're expecting to actually be building and what we are still in the design roadmap stage for. So if I miscategorize something, feel free to move it. Tim, did you have issues for the audit logging stuff? Just assuming whatever is in this list will become stale, and so if we have a pointer to something we can go look at current status on.
I didn't see an open issue for audit logging yet. I need to sync up with the people who have been working on it and figure out exactly where we stand right now. So this is something that I'm going to be taking on in 1.7 time frame, but haven't come up to speed on yet.
Okay. And is this in the API or in the CRI kubelet or?
This will be cluster wide.
Okay. All right.
I'll look for an issue in file one if I don't see one.
Okay. And the seccomp stuff, is that you too, Tim?
I'm not sure if I'm how much I'm going to be able to do on it. So definitely help wanted if anyone else has interest in that. It should be very straightforward, especially if we get pod security policy enabled by default. The only complication is to think about how to roll it out without breaking existing clusters, mostly around upgrades.
Yep. Yeah, I would encourage us to think about that as we are building out these things. One of the things we sort of lucked into with the union authorization stuff was that you could run your legacy policy in union with the RBAC stuff afterwards, and so you could log denials from RBAC, but then fall back to your legacy policy. So we
Kudos to Jordan for implementing the union, I think.
so we sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart, but yeah. So having that in mind, like as we're building out these like necessary ways to lock down a cluster, thinking, there are lots of clusters that aren't locked down. What are we going to do to help them not fall over when they upgrade? One thing I didn't see in here that I kind of wanted to talk about, maybe this is part of the secret stuff, is the idea of service account tokens that are generated but not persisted. So right now, service account tokens get persisted and then pulled from the kubelet and mounted into pods. Like, forgetting what currently exists, it would be nice to be able to, for a correctly authorized party, to ask for a service account token and the cluster make one, and some record of that token be persisted so that you could revoke it or see that it had been requested, but for the secret itself to not be persisted or be retrievable. So it's a read once type of operation. So Eric, I don't know if you had that in your head for some of the secret proposal stuff you were looking at, or if that was separate.
A little bit. I have a more general mechanism, but I think can address that. We could still have a discussion as whether or not it's urgent enough to not wait for the more general mechanism.
I wouldn't say it's urgent. It's just, yeah, we can talk about the general stuff and then see if that falls out of that. Eric Chang, you said probably not the CRL stuff. Is there someone who is familiar with CRL mechanisms who would like to work on this? This is something that I wish we already had addressed and would like to see addressed, but is kind of perpetually not at the top of my list.
Yeah, I'm happy to push that forward or do whatever, to get that merged. It's more just like, at this point, I don't know how exactly we would use it. So it's sort of hard for me to give know that this is the right thing.
Yeah.
Is this CRL for the Kubernetes certificate generation API that's currently just used by kubelets, or is this a more general?
This is a general. So anything that takes a CA bundle to honor client cert authentication would also take a CRL and allow revoking client certs. So the components that do that are the API server and the kubelet today.
This feels like it's not 1.7.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I guess the more we get these client cert rotation in place, the shorter our client certs durations need to be. Some of the core ones, like the control plane and the Bootstrap super user, still might be difficult to rotate like every 4 hours or something. But yeah.
So that was our general attitude too. We're really interested in seeing kubelet server cert bootstrapping in 1.7. Though it sounds like that's already being worked on based off of conversations. We had actually big issues with doing the kubelet API authentication in like auto scaling groups because it's hard to uniquely generate certs without knowing beforehand what the IP is going to be.
Yeah, and I think as the node authorizer stuff gets in place, some of these things will start to fit together. So if a node is only allowed to update its own status, and the certificate approver will only approve serving certs for nodes that have subject alt names that match the IPs that the node is claiming. I think some of these can start to fit together to make sort of a coherent picture, but yeah, kind of need several pieces.
Yeah.
And Jacob, you actually are working on the server cert stuff. I know you had the client cert rotation, but you are working on the server stuff too.
Yeah, so I actually, when I was first developing the certificate rotation bit, I worked on the server, and I have something that's fairly close right now. I have a branch. It needs to be cleaned up a little bit more.
Okay.
And then in conjunction with that, there's the kubelet client certificate rotation that I'm going to be doing.
Okay. Do you have an issue or a feature for the server cert stuff, or does this all fall under the TLS Bootstrap feature umbrella?
I don't have a separate issue for the server one. I can come up with it. It sort of, when I started looking at the certificate rotation, I ended up finding different places where there were certificates.
Yep.
And I just started looking at a couple of them.
Okay.
Is there work to be done on the approver side of things for that? Because like it said, once you're approved for the client cert, it's fairly trivial to say that user can get the server cert.
Yes, there is work. Let me add that. That was actually something that I intended to do for 1.6, but 1.6 ended. So this is the CSR approval, like auto approval. So right now it is based on a flag passed to the controller manager, but I think we want to switch that to be an authorization check. So we would do the same detection we're doing now to say, is this a node client cert? Like, does it fit the characteristics that we expect for a node client cert? And if so, does the user that submitted the CSR, are they authorized to ask for a node client cert? And so we would change that from a hard-coded check against a flag group to an actual authorization check. And then I would expect a similar detection to say, does this look like a node server cert request? And is the user that requested it authorized to do that? So I had planned to work on that, and I forgot to add that in. All right. The secret segmentation, do you want me to just, I think that probably falls under your topic, Eric. So I'm going to leave that. Bulk namespace access control. I know Clayton had opened that issue, so I'm going to stick his name beside that.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of overlap with that one from the secret segmentation under Eric's roadmap for secrets. But I think there's an orthogonal one, which is, just so folks are aware, because we did discuss this on a previous call, but I want to reiterate, as we get more and more integration type scenarios, we really only have two buckets for integrators to use. They can integrate with the whole cluster and basically see everything, or they can integrate with one namespace at a time, or they can do, fan out queries for every single namespace that they want to integrate with. And there's probably some, as people run larger and larger clusters, as people want to segment who can do what, it would be very difficult to effectively build integrations. Also, as we move towards self-hosting, code that you want to run almost everything on the cluster, except you don't want it accessing the self-hosted controllers, because then it can get access to the service accounts and then it can root your cluster, et cetera. Those sorts of challenges necessitate something to explore something in that area, even if we don't actually go build a fully generic multi-level ACL solution. We need to at least be able to make some recommendations.
Okay. All right, and Tim, before I move your 2 items in, these are things you are working on, plan to work on. We'll tag someone else to work on. I just want to make sure that the people listed here are the people who are good contact points for chasing what's being done.
I'm committed to audit logging for 1.7.
Okay. All right. Well, good. 1.6 hasn't shipped yet, and I feel like 1.7 is already completely filled up. Okay. Does anyone have other items they're planning to work on, or things that they see that they think should be higher priority than these things? We can debate that. That might be good to hear if people are looking at this list going, well, wait, what about X, Y, Z?
I think it's worth mentioning at least the extension, admission control extension will be on SIG API machinery, but people who want to build policy integrations that aren't covered here, the hope would be that SIG API machinery is able to assist people who want to go build custom policies that are not captured in the list of things that we would go implement.
And are you rolling initializers and webhook admission into that? Okay.
Yeah.
What is I'm trying to remember the issue.
I have no idea. I'm not Brian. I can't remember these things.
There you go. All right. Well, if you do start working on something else, feature, bug fix, feel free to tag your issues or polls with SIG Auth, or mention the group and we can tag them, and email the group, let people know what you're working on. And I will probably start a few threads for some of the documentation add-on items, and copy yourself into that.
Hey, I've done a couple doc plans, so feel free to share with me and/or suggestions on best templates to use for different docs.
Okay. All right. Oh, I did want to mention that I did get the GitHub teams and Google groups set up to mirror all the different GitHub mentions. So if you are interested in following those, you can subscribe to the Google groups, see all the exciting GitHub PR requests that we're asked to review, things like that. So that is set up for SIG Auth now, if you are interested. All right.
Christopher wanted to talk about bulk namespace control at the end, so don't drop off before we talk about that.
Okay. Was there anything else we wanted to talk about before we jump to that? All right, then. Let me open up that issue. Bulk. All right. That's what we want to talk about.
I just wanted to assess kind of like what the priority of this type of thing is. I put my name down as a person that would be interested in helping to implement parts of this, albeit not being very familiar with the SIG Auth type of code.
Mm-hmm.
But the immediate use case that we had for this is thinking forward towards like the multi-tenant clusters and whatnot. You can block different namespaces from accessing other namespaces DNS, but there's still an information leak, so you can still prod at DNS and find out other people's. When we first proposed this to SIG network, it seemed to kind of bounce back like, well, what if we had a way of controlling access like this generically? And it got brought up on a mailing list somewhere, and then that's what I guess Clayton, you had already been pondering this for a while, so this issue is open. So I'm definitely interested in helping to work on this. I'm not sure if napkin design is just like, or they're like J.K. Rowling, just scribbling out some great stuff, but it's going to take a while.
Yeah, I mean, the DNS stuff was definitely a very specific one. That one's maybe a little bit harder because that's actually a service. I mean, I think the use cases, this was a little bit more targeted towards the API side, and definitely DNS is an API, but because it's on a different type of server, it's a little bit more complex. So I didn't want to say that the DNS stuff depended on this. There is some overlap in terms of how people think about, if you're going to do deep segmentation, if you're not exposing the API to end users, it's less of an issue. This is a little bit more, if you have end users hitting the Cube API directly, how do you start getting some subdivision beyond just a namespace?
Right, and I guess that's part of, it plays into like the multi-tenant part that we wanted to. So for example, if you do have, say you have like a particular team that's responsible for service A and the other is responsible for service B, but they need to communicate with each other, but no other services. That's where I guess I thought the project or organization, whatever the in beta name was, would be helpful, because you would be able to wrap together different namespaces. But if I'm not on project B or project C, then I wouldn't want to see everything that namespace has access to. So I agree that, yeah, the DNS is unfortunately a more difficult use case. Would you think that, though, this type of feature would be relevant to that, or do you think DNS per namespace is kind of not really involved? Maybe it should focus on a different thing.
I mean, I think that you could do DNS per namespace with some, with some bits of elbow grease that wouldn't really need to touch this. But I do think it is much more difficult to do. It's getting that single one is easy. The bulk one is hard for sure.
I mean, one of the things we talked about specifically around the network stuff, so network and DNS issues, is requiring things to declare like what services they are using, and that gives a point at which to apply policy. So if policy says this namespace is allowed to consume services in that namespace, and you try to record that I consume service whatever in some other namespace, like policy can prevent you from recording that. And that gives either the DNS server or the kube proxy like specific persisted objects that say this pod should only be able to talk to these services or ask DNS about these namespaces, because we've persisted the services that we depend on. Until we have like a persisted declaration of what things we are consuming, I think applying policy to a DNS server or a kube proxy just sort of out of thin air is going to be really tough, because it then has to authenticate, essentially authenticate all requests to it and figure out who you are, and requests to DNS don't normally carry authentication. So I see this as being really helped by the discussions around like declare what services you consume, and we can apply policy to let you declare that, and then let the network layers be informed by those declarations.
Yeah, and I think this is a challenge too with the way that Kube does DNS. Like, we had taken a different approach in OpenShift. We actually, because the service proxy effectively has all the same info that you need for DNS, and because we had gone down a path of doing multi-tenant network isolation out of the box, like every namespace is hard isolated from every other namespace. We had been incentivized to put DNS alongside the service proxy. Obviously, the name ends up resolving to the service proxy anyway. They share the same data. The service proxy and or a local node agent is the one who has the best info from a security perspective about where a DNS packet comes from. Mm-hmm. So if you know where that comes from and you can track it back to that node, you've effectively, your query set to figure out the who to what is somewhat reduced. So you can say, pod IP, what are the pods in this node? Okay, that's that pod, it's in this namespace. Follow the links. That today, with the way that we implement kubedns, would be a little bit more difficult. Certainly not impossible, though. And I think that's where it starts bouncing back to the networking team. So I think this is an unfortunate case of, I think you could go build this today. I think it's pretty hard to build in Kube today, or to get over the various humps, because it's not a clear use case for anybody who's not doing namespace isolation aggressively.
Yeah. So all that to say, the bulk namespace access control was primarily API focused, but could be a really useful building block for API-centric objects, or API objects that would inform network policy. So, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, because I think today you could just create a bunch of network policies restricting actual communication between namespaces that you didn't want, but you would still have that information leak. You could still query and look for them.
Yeah,
regardless of if you
network policy is only inbound, though, isn't it? I think it's only.
I forget.
Yeah, it is, and the network egress policy is not sorted out, but that is that has to be imposed coming out of the net namespace. So that is a spot where you could do it for sure. Like if you had a virtual IP for every DNS server, every namespace is DNS server. Maybe you could figure out a way to bump it back to that or something.
Yeah, I mean, if the bulk namespace access control feels like the thing that should happen prior to something like this, then I'm all for helping to work out what's necessary to get there.
I mean, I think the book is related, but I wouldn't say, if you wanted to get to that point, I would say don't wait for the bulk access. Part of the reason I worry about that is the bulk namespace access control is a bunch of, interesting storage level and code abstraction problems, as well as just plain old, like, how can you scale and what are the pragmatic trade-offs, because we're not going to build a generalized access control system. And I mean, even like at the start, the hard things are going to be doing access control on labels is a whole bunch of design challenges that I think you have to argue through. So it's not like given the normal amount of, given the rate at which an average design proposal goes through Kubernetes, and given the number of thorny and or argumentative and or complex problems that nobody really feels comfortable saying that they know the exact solution to, I think this is about 100 times more difficult than a normal issue. Design-wise, not to say that we can't or shouldn't go do it, but I think this is probably certainly a multi-release sort of, we come up with a design and then fight a bunch, and then people would renege and go back and decide they didn't like the design, and then we come back at a different angle, and then 3 things would change in Cube that would completely invalidate the design, et cetera, et cetera.
The network egress policy, like pushing forward on the design for that with an eye towards how it would connect to authorization checks and connect to declarations of what services you consume, I think that can be done in parallel. The bulk namespace stuff I see as a more convenient way to manage policy across a set of namespaces. But you could accomplish the same thing less conveniently by, just set the same policy in these 5 namespaces and then go list objects inside each namespace. Like, it's less convenient, but you can actually accomplish it. I see that as sort of orthogonal to the network egress policy stuff. So Chris, I don't know if you've talked to the network team, the SIG network, about some of the egress policy, or have a good feel for where that's at. I haven't been following it that closely, actually.
We've kind of just brought up the problem quite a lot, and
Okay.
I think it just got pushed out because there was some rumblings of this type of organization or thing that combined together multiple namespaces. And that's why I think it got pushed, like, well, let's just wait for that type of a thing. But yeah, I guess quite easily, like if you do just say, okay, every namespace can only see DNS entries within its namespace, the next evolution is quickly like, okay, what if team A and team B want to talk to each other? Do they have to deploy in the same namespace? Or so maybe that's why it made sense for the bulk namespace controller. But I'll certainly look into, are there interim steps that can be taken with egress?
Okay. All right. Does anyone have any other topics? We've got about 10 minutes. And I'm sorry, was the seccomp stuff you, Tim, as well?
You can put my name on it.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm looking for someone else to own it potentially.
Yep, it's written in stone. All right. If there are no other topics, we can go ahead and wrap up. All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Have a good one.